Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jill Williams. I'm an addiction psychiatrist at Rutgers, and for this project, working with the CPI team and the City of New York on addressing tobacco. So Rusty, Noah, and Nancy are all here with me today. We're going to have about an hour to talk about Tobacco Control 101, a discussion of new trends and products. It's useful sometimes to have the big picture and to understand the larger world of tobacco use and tobacco control and how it impacts our patients. This is just my disclosure information. So our learning objectives for today are to understand some of the history, including the Master Settlement Agreement, how that impacts practices today, look at some new products, especially e-cigarettes, which people often have a lot of questions about, and understand some of the other public health mechanisms that decrease tobacco use in the population. The Surgeon General's report, it's hard to believe, it's more than 50 years old now, the original one that came out about tobacco and health consequences. So there was an update, 50 years of progress, if you're interested in reading about this information or having a resource for it. So in case you're not aware, there was a historic event that happened in 1998 called the Master Settlement Agreement. This was a lawsuit where all of the state attorney generals essentially banded together and sued the tobacco industry. It ultimately included 46 states, so not all participated, but most did. And it was a lawsuit seeking to recover the costs that the states had paid for decades treating sick and dying cigarette smokers. The way that they got the tobacco industry was through violation of federal business laws, federal laws about consumer protection and antitrust. So, you know, technically in the United States, you cannot collude secretly with your business rival, and that's what there was evidence that the tobacco industry had done that for decades. And the lawsuit was essentially against all of the big six U.S. tobacco companies, so they were all included in it. So one of the results of the Master Settlement Agreement was a ban on youth advertising. So a lot of tactics that the industry had done for years went away with the Master Settlement Agreement, and specifically there was a banning of cartoon characters in cigarette advertisements, but that wasn't the only thing. Tobacco companies were technically not allowed to sponsor events that children might attend, like baseball games or other sort of public events or concerts. They were banned from most outdoor advertising, so many billboards went away as a result of this. They were no longer allowed to visit school or college campuses and give free samples of cigarettes to students, and it set the minimum cigarette purchase size at 20, which is a pack. So as I'm going through some of this information, you might ask yourself, is the industry seem to be complying with these rules and regulations that were implemented in 1998? Well, we do know cartoon advertising did really go away. There's no more Joe Camel. He was laid to rest. And certainly I remember seeing a lot of these ads when I was growing up, but cartoons are no longer used. So what happened to the tobacco industry? Well, they certainly didn't go out of business as a result of this. In fact, if you look, you can really see what happens in terms of that they changed their advertising strategies. Because they were banned in certain venues, they shifted nearly all their advertising to what's called point of sale. So you see directly after the Master Settlement Agreement in 1998, almost all tobacco advertising shifts to point of sale. This means advertising at the level of the store, but it also means that tremendous financial incentives are given to convenience store owners. There's all kinds of price discounts, 2 for 1, and those are all included in point-of-sale advertising. So, for example, the majority of tobacco ads now are at the gas station and convenience store. You might wonder why those ads are 3 feet from the floor and ask yourself if they're next to the lollipops, who are they really trying to attract? So stores are paid a lot of money to put all those signs up. And so signs at the point of sale are the big way tobacco industry does their advertising. A lot of these are price promotions like 2 for deals and money paid to retailers for advertising space. You know, nowadays, kids grow up knowing that cigarettes are bad. It's taught in grammar school curriculum. There's the DARE program. So, you know, I have children myself, and there's lots of examples where this is addressed in school, and I think most kids grow up nowadays knowing that cigarettes are bad. In fact, you could say as a result of those efforts, cigarette smoking is at an all-time low, and that's the good news today. Teen smoking is at an all-time low, and that includes cigarettes and most combustible products. But if you were the tobacco industry and you need to hook your next generation of customers, you need to get around that. And maybe the tobacco industry does that with look-alike or new products. And so another thing that's happened as a result of the master settlement is really an explosion of new types of tobacco products. And you might say, well, maybe that's how you now are ingenious in getting the next generation of kids hooked on nicotine. So, for example, products are developed all the time and tried in test market. They don't all make it, but these are two examples of products that have been developed and test marketed. One of them were tobacco orbs. You can see they're about the size of a Tic Tac. It's not a nicotine lozenge, which contains only nicotine. This is actually tobacco ground up into a lozenge. Another example would be a tobacco strip, which looks a lot like a breath strip, same size and shape. If you look at the packaging that's used for those products, it's not a coincidence that it looks a lot like a cell phone. That's on purpose. Nothing is an accident in the tobacco industry. So maybe if you're a kid and you're trying these products and you have this in your pocket, your parents don't know because it looks like you're holding a cell phone. The other area where there's been a lot of development of new product is in flavors, like Cherry Crush cigars. And so there's a huge amount of new flavored tobacco that's available that wasn't available 20 years ago. You can see in this ad, in this example, these pictures, these are all flavored cigars that are sold in the local store. And so if you go to a convenience store, you might see all these pink and bright colored cigars. Ask yourself if your grandfather really wanted Cherry Crush cigars or if this is marketing to children. And it's very interesting that these products, which are on the right side of the slide, are really packaged and marketed to look a lot like magic markers and lip gloss and things that might be appealing to children. Another area where there's been new product development is hookah. Now, essentially, hookah is not new. It's been on the planet for thousands of years. But all of a sudden, there's hookah bars and stores on every college campus where they weren't there 30 years ago. So there's been an explosion of hookah into the market. Hookah is essentially smoking through a water pipe. Kids might like it. It's social. Kids reflect and say things to their parents like it's not smoking. They feel like something different. It's safe. It's not the same as a cigarette. And so, again, maybe that's a way to introduce kids to smoking if they grow up learning that cigarettes are bad. It's an interesting idea that they showed up on college campuses all of a sudden out of nowhere, because if you think about what smoking through a water pipe or a hookah does is it reduces the harshness of smoke. The water reduces the harshness, so maybe people don't cough or have irritating side effects. And what a great way to introduce young people to smoking if you can reduce the harshness of smoke. So really thinking about this as a gateway product. A lot of people think hookah is not harmful in any way. Sometimes people smoke mixes of herbs and things that don't even contain tobacco or nicotine. But the truth is that when anything burns, it creates toxic carbon monoxide. And carbon monoxide, of course, then comes from hookah because hookah burns. And people have done studies on this and shown that the hookah levels in a single night that come from smoking hookah are 30 to 40 parts per million, which is the equivalent carbon monoxide exposure of a 2-pack-a-day smoker. So clearly it's not true that this is without risk. People are putting a lot of carbon monoxide and other smoke components into their body when they smoke hookah, and that's clearly not safe. Remember that the reason we have smoke-free bars and restaurants in the United States right now is because we worried about other people in the environment and their exposure to smoke. And just to give you a comparison to hookah, those kind of levels might be in the range of 5 to 10 parts per million. So anybody might be exposed to carbon monoxide in a smoky bar. That was banned, yet hookah is delivering much higher levels than that. Who are the users of hookah? It's primarily a white male, higher levels of education, no children, so kind of a student profile. Hookah smokers also tend to be cigarette smokers as well. There are also, just to say a few things about other forms of tobacco, there's lots of forms of chewing tobacco. Sometimes people think that that's a safer alternative and will help them to quit smoking, but you have to remind people that chewing tobacco contains a lot of carcinogens, including nitrosamines. Nitrosamines are one of the cancer-causing chemicals that are naturally occurring in the tobacco plant. So chewing tobacco, moist or dry snuff, any of it really has the potential to cause cancer in the mouth, neck, throat area because of the presence of carcinogens. So really not a safer alternative. When people use smokeless tobacco, they get a whole range of problems, including stained teeth, gum problems, blisters and sores in their mouth. They certainly become addicted to the nicotine that's in the chewing tobacco. They can lose teeth and have mouth cancer, oral cancer. Dentists have gotten pretty good about screening people for lesions and cancer on dental appointments if you're a smokeless tobacco user. So if you have abnormal lesions in your mouth already from chewing tobacco, 3 to 5% of those will actually go on to become cancer. The amount of nicotine that you get from chewing tobacco is pretty good. So one of the difficulties in developing products that people like and will use to help them quit smoking is that they're never quite as good as tobacco in delivering nicotine to people. So of course cigarettes give you a big hit of nicotine, but so does chewing tobacco. And of course the tobacco industry, it's not entirely by accident because the tobacco industry really manipulates the tobacco, changes the pH, changes some of the chemicals to increase the addictive potential of chew. So you can get a pretty good hit of nicotine from it. One of the more interesting but somewhat controversial products includes something called snus. So I don't know if you've noticed this new product, Zyn, NT, which has showed up in some stores. NT means no tobacco. Snus is a new variation of chewing tobacco that's essentially nitrosamine-free. So people have developed a version of tobacco that basically grows without the carcinogens. And that's what sort of this is. It's a form of chewing tobacco that has a very reduced potential for cancer because essentially the nitrosamines and the carcinogens have been, not entirely, but mostly removed. It was launched in Montana and Colorado in 2014 and is pretty much widespread nowadays, and it comes from Sweden. It's considered to be very controversial in this country. In Sweden, they've taken a public health approach to really widely publicize this to cigarette smokers, in particular men, and to say to male cigarette smokers, you should use snus, you'd be better off, and you won't get the health consequences that you would get from smoking. People have discussed that kind of approach in the United States now for 10 years, and the public health community is ambivalent about endorsing the use of snus in lieu of smoking, although you could imagine the risk is much less, and Sweden has shown that lung cancer rates have gone down in that country since the introduction of snus. The last new product, of course, the one that gets a lot of attention, are e-cigarettes or ENDS, electronic nicotine delivery systems. I think public opinion is changing a bit on these products, but we still have to be somewhat cautious. A lot of them are coming from overseas. They have not been tested or regulated in this country. Many of them are also manufactured by the makers of cigarettes, Big Tobacco, and we have concerns about trusting them entirely. The idea of an e-cigarette is an interesting idea. It's basically a device that contains a battery and a heating element, and then there's some nicotine in a solution. So essentially when you turn it on and puff on it or suck on it, what happens is that the battery turns on the heating element, it heats up the nicotine solution, and it creates this mist or vape that the person then puts into their body, that they sort of breathe in. Because the nicotine technically is heated but it does not burn, the idea is that many less chemicals go to the user. So most of the chemicals and the most toxic things come because tobacco burns, and that's what creates smoke and carbon monoxide. So the idea behind an e-cigarette is technically they're not burning, they're just heating up the nicotine, and therefore a lot fewer chemicals are delivered to the person. So in theory, they're certainly safer than a cigarette, although we don't know that they're entirely safe for reasons that I'll say, but mainly because they've not been tested or regulated in any way. Frankly, there are thousands of them on the market. They're all different. They may or may not contain what they say that they contain. There's no quality assurance in the manufacturing process. The newer ones use e-juice that you buy in bottles, like on the left here, your e-liquid, and you put that into your device. And again, that liquid has the potential for contamination because it hasn't been tested or regulated in any way. So when people take e-cigarettes to the lab and take them apart and see what's in them, it turns out that the nicotine is usually in a solution of either propylene glycol, ethylene glycol, or glycerin. Those are commonly used compounds that are in a lot of household products. However, one potential danger is that when you heat those chemicals up, those three chemicals, and breathe them in, that may not be so good for your lungs. So that's a little bit of a cause for concern. Some of the flavoring agents, so a lot of these, again, are cherry flavor, vanilla flavor, mocha flavor. The sweeteners and flavors sometimes have toxic effects because, again, they're not being regulated by the FDA. The vape itself might contain metals, formaldehyde, and carcinogens, but the truth is that they are found at levels of only about 1% compared to a cigarette, so a lot less than those similar chemicals and carcinogens in terms of smoking cigarettes. When e-cigarettes first came out, and you tried to use one, the amount of nicotine that you would get in your body is the blue line, which is pretty low, and a lot less than you might get from a real cigarette, which is the green line. So they were quickly modified and changed. New products became available to try and give people more nicotine through them, because if people aren't really liking them and getting a good hit of nicotine, they won't keep using them. And now they've really quickly already evolved to where they actually give people a lot of nicotine. The bigger the device, the bigger the battery, the more it can heat up the nicotine to a hotter temperature, and that's what now produces really the same amount of nicotine that you would get from a cigarette. So they've quickly evolved to become much better in terms of giving people a pretty big hit of nicotine. Okay, so we said teen smoking is at an all-time low, and that's the good news. But the bad news is, well, what if those kids have just swapped out for other products, including e-cigarettes? Because e-cigarette use really is exploding, no pun intended, among youth We kind of even can't keep up with the data in terms of the numbers of high schoolers and junior high students using e-cigarettes. It is rampant in schools right now. And since 2014, that was the first year that kids were using more e-cigarettes than traditional cigarettes, and that trend has continued. And we really don't know the long-term consequences of this. If kids are using e-cigarettes at 10, 12, 14, what does that mean for them over their lifetime? Are they more likely to go on and smoke cigarettes? Well, we don't know for sure, but the emerging data seems to suggest yes. Are these kids more likely to smoke pot than other kids in the school? Again, emerging data suggests yes. So again, if teens are using them in huge numbers, that's somewhat troubling. It may just be the gateway to cigarettes and other drugs, and that really has the potential to undo 50 years of progress in reducing tobacco use in the United States. What about using them in chronic smokers, people who have been unable to quit smoking? Is it effective for them? Should we tell people to use e-cigarettes? Well, at this point, the data is still mixed. Some studies seem to suggest e-cigarettes could be helpful for people quitting smoking. Other studies show that they don't work. So we really don't know right now. So I personally don't recommend that people use them when they try to quit smoking, especially if they ask me. I say, I'd really rather you use the evidence-based treatments, the things that I know are safe and tested, and generally free. Why would you spend money on this if you can get free treatment that we know works? When they do help people quit smoking, they're really no better than patches and nicotine gum. So they're equivalent perhaps, but really no better. So again, I would steer people towards the evidence-based treatments. This is a risk as well, and I was a little bit not believing this in the beginning. But when you go on the internet and you search this, you can find many, many examples of local town newspapers from towns all over the country that report that this happens, that they spontaneously explode, and really cause significant burns to people and or broken bones. So while you're using them, remember these are cheap electronics that came from overseas, so there's nothing to say that they might not explode, and they do explode in people's faces while they're using them, causing some severe burns. But in addition, there have been cases of them spontaneously exploding in somebody's back pocket even when they're not turned on, and that's the impact of that explosion has been great enough to break people's legs, have broken bones. So I mean, that's pretty significant. That's why the airlines have essentially banned them, because they don't want an explosion on the plane. So that's a risk as well. One of the concerns in this country is that there hasn't really been compelling data that people are using them to quit smoking. Because remember, if people quit smoking, it's almost like any way they get there, you have to be happy. It's nothing is as bad as smoking, so it's always good to see people quitting smoking. But that doesn't seem to be matching the American experience, where most e-cigarette users, if you really talk to them, interview them, do testing, are also still smoking regular cigarettes. So sometimes they're using their e-cigarette where it's convenient or where they're not able to smoke, and other times they're still smoking. So that's not really better. They're just becoming dual users. That's not as good evidence as if people were actually quitting. Another cause for concern, especially in the behavioral health field, is that you cannot tell an e-cigarette from a cannabis vaping device. And newer examples are even better than these on this picture. But essentially, you can't tell which is which. There are versions, the new products that are out now, the Juul, that are being used by, all high school kids are using the Juul, which is the new e-cigarette. It looks almost identical to a cannabis vaping device. So you can't tell them apart. So if you were to introduce them into your milieu, I would be concerned, and I would say you better start drug screening people because you really can't tell what people are using. And that goes for the stores. I mean, the stores that sell them, they look like head shops. There's a lot of other drug paraphernalia in those settings. And kids very quickly figured out as well how to just modify their e-cigarette to use it for hash oil. So they pretty much go hand in hand, and that would be my concern in terms of bringing them into a milieu under this idea that this would be a great way to help people quit smoking. I would have a lot of concerns about that. This is a little bit out of date now because there are some regulations that are starting to take place. The new, just very briefly, the FDA's new stance, if you want to read about it, you can go online, is to begin to regulate in some way, I haven't exactly said how, the use of e-cigarettes, and to maybe promote them more as an alternative to people who've been unable to quit other ways. So stay tuned. This is rapidly changing. But more testing is an important and necessary step. Other parts of the Master Settlement Agreement include that the states got a lot of money, more than $206 billion over 25 years. The first year, New Jersey, for example, got $30 million, so there were upfront payments, but this was a recurring payment that was made to states that was supposed to essentially go on for a very long period of time. What happened, though, is that states had the option, you know, in the lottery, you could take the cash payment or the ongoing annuity payments, and most states decided to take a one-time cash out to cash in their chips, and they used the money essentially to balance the budget 10, 15 years ago. So there's actually an interesting report on this website, the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, that really talks about how nearly all this money is now gone, and there's a lot of examples that the states actually wasted or squandered the money. Very few states actually used it to help smokers. In the map of tobacco control, there's not many states that fund tobacco at the level that the CDC recommends, but New York's in the better group, at least spending something. I feel like New York's doing a very good job, but it's really a small group of states that actually fund at the level that the CDC recommends. Remember, there is a lot of money potentially out there to help smokers when you consider not only the money that some states still receive through the Master Settlement Agreement. Some still do receive money, although not many, and the money generated from cigarette tax every year. So, for example, so on the left, it's summing together all of that money. Hundreds of billions of dollars go into the state budget every year from cigarettes or from one of these sources, and very little is actually spent to help people stop smoking or to do tobacco prevention. New Jersey, for example, generates $700 to $800 million a year in cigarette tax, of which zero has gone to help people with tobacco addiction. So there is potentially money that could be used, but most places are not doing it. And you might think, well, with all of these sanctions of the Master Settlement, it must have been really hard for the tobacco industry, but the truth is that they're rolling in money and making more profits than ever. So that seems a bit curious, but is true. There's a part of public health that's called tobacco control. I've been referring to this idea, tobacco control. What is this? Well, it's really efforts both aimed at prevention and cessation. So the techniques that work include keeping high the price of tobacco, and price is essentially manipulated through cigarette tax. But that's not the only way. There are policies and regulations that make it hard for people to smoke, and that's, again, a positive, felt to be a positive effect, because when it's hard to smoke, more people will try to quit and fewer people will start. Another part of a comprehensive tobacco control program is to have options to help people to quit, like a telephone quit line or free medication like nicotine replacement, to make sure that your state insures the workers in that state to get help to quit smoking, to have things in place to keep it hard for youth to start smoking, and then to continue to do research, local surveillance, and then something that's called counter-advertising, which I'll talk more about. So we know that tax works. This is an example of a good tax that we should all be behind. New York, New Jersey, some states have done really well in this, in raising the cigarette tax. Again, this is a good thing because it helps more people to be motivated to try to quit, and it keeps teens from starting. Price is one of the most effective ways for preventing teen smoking. One of the questions that comes up is, what about people with mental illness and addiction? As the price goes up, do they stop smoking? And it's not as clear that it has a strong an effect on our populations. That's for a lot of reasons. Imagine, even if cocaine was expensive, there'd still be people addicted to it. So at some point, if people are heavily addicted, price essentially doesn't matter. But there haven't been a lot of studies of this. Another issue that concerns me is that for the people we treat, there's often a subsidy. There's another group of people buying them tobacco, and it's often their family. So I think it's important to have a discussion with family members, family groups, and really talk about this, because although this is well-intentioned and comes out of a place of compassion, we might want to reframe it that if families aren't buying a case of beer for their son or scoring crack or heroin for their loved one, then maybe they really shouldn't be buying this drug either. The other thing that patients are doing to get around the high price of cigarettes is, you may have noticed now everybody smokes these brown cigarettes. What are they? Well, technically they're cigars, because when you wrap tobacco in tobacco, it has a different legal definition, and that's a cigar, even though really it's a cigarette for all intents and purposes. So if you sell cigars, they're exempt from the cigarette tax, and they're a lot cheaper. And so our patients have sort of traded off to these alternative products as well to avoid the impact of tax and price. Policy certainly works. In fact, you could argue that policy has been the most effective strategy in the United States, and the reason that cigarette smoking is at 16% in the USA today. It's very hard to smoke. It protects people from secondhand smoke when there are tobacco-free policies, but it also helps smokers to quit more. It keeps teens from smoking. And remember, traditionally, psychiatry and mental health have been exempted from these policies. But we don't want exemptions, and so we do want to increase policies in the behavioral health setting as part of a successful intervention, because we know that policy works. In terms of offering people help to quitting, if you think about who smokes in the U.S. today more than any other groups, it's the poor and the mentally ill. And it turns out that those groups have Medicaid as their number one type of insurance. And Medicaid is doing poorly on a national level, because remember, Medicaid decisions are made locally in each of the 50 states. And from state to state, there's a lot of variation, and Medicaid has not traditionally done a great job in providing services to help individuals quit smoking. So in terms of national effort, that's really where I think efforts need to be focused. For example, if you look at the money that Medicaid spends on tobacco-related diseases, right, that's $22 billion. Lots of money goes to pay for the health consequences of smoking. Very little, a drop in the bucket, less than 1% of that is spent to help people stop smoking. So you can imagine that helping people stop smoking is actually cost-effective. It actually saves the system a lot of money. But these policies have been very slow to change. There's recommendations that Medicaid really open up the benefit, provide reimbursement to healthcare providers to do counseling, and to remove any barriers on receiving the medication to give people the greatest chances for quitting. The good news for you is that New York has really been maybe the best, if not one of the top 5 states in the country in terms of removing barriers in the Medicaid population. So there's actually very good access right now to medication and other support, both in New York City and New York State, so that you're very lucky that most of these barriers don't exist in your state, and you should be able to get very good access to tobacco treatment medications because New York has policies that say we can't limit it for our patients. They need every chance they can get. The last thing I'll just briefly talk about today is something called counter-advertising. Counter-advertising is another part of this overall tobacco control approach to say how can we educate people and inform them with messages, especially ones that counter the effects of advertising that the tobacco industry does. And again, New York's done a lot of this. It continues to do this. I see the same TV advertisements that you do showing the problems and illnesses related to smoking because I'm in New Jersey, so I see those ads, and they're very good. And so counter-advertising is another aspect of combating this problem through education and through messaging. The Truth Campaign, for example, is a nonprofit, and they've been very committed to educating young people to stop smoking in the next generation. And they have a lot of terrific advertisements and resources, many of which you can find for free on the internet if you work with younger populations. And in particular, what studies have shown is that some of the most appealing messages to young people are messages about don't be a victim of the tobacco industry, that actually works better. Don't be duped, don't be fooled by the tobacco industry, that really appeals to young people much more than a message of health. But this is actually one example of even an up-to-date Truth ad which says, 60 minutes of smoking is the equivalent of 100 cigarettes. So again, their information is up to date to reflect the newer trends like hookah, and they've been quite successful and they're quite powerful in their images. This is one of my favorite that the Truth Campaign has come up with. So really clever messaging in terms of reaching out to young people. So I'll show you this one. Hopefully it will work. Oops, I don't think it worked. So we have some videos embedded here. I'm not sure they're going to work. Let me try one more time. Okay, another example of counter-advertising is this ad. I don't know if you're aware, but African Americans overwhelmingly prefer and smoke menthol brands. Like 95% of African Americans smoke menthol brands like Newport and Cool. And so this is an example of counter-advertising. How cool is that? So a play on words. Some interesting things about African American smokers. In general, on average, they smoke fewer cigarettes per day than other populations. When groups smoke fewer cigarettes per day, you would expect that they would be more successful in trying to quit because they're less addicted. And you might expect that they get overall less tobacco-related diseases than other groups because they smoke fewer cigarettes a day. And neither of that is true. In fact, African Americans who smoke fewer cigarettes per day get more diseases from tobacco than other populations, and they have a harder time quitting. So people have really wondered about the possibility of menthol impacting those outcomes. Menthol, it's possible that it makes cigarettes more addictive. Menthol itself may be slightly rewarding or reinforcing. If you think about what menthol brands do, they contain this flavoring agent, menthol, which is the same menthol that's in cold medicines and other things. And so menthol is essentially, one of its effects is that it kind of anesthetizes the airway. So if you're a new smoker or a young smoker and you smoke menthol, again, it reduces the harshness of smoke. Maybe for African Americans that means that, because it's changing the way that they smoke, what's called the smoking topography, that they're smoking in a way that they're getting more toxins out of the cigarette or more nicotine. Those are both possibilities that people have wondered about. So menthol cigarettes themselves may be more addictive and more likely to produce disease even than non-menthol cigarettes. It's one of the only cigarette characteristics that I can tell you actually matters, menthol versus non. So again, this is a really, I think, powerful counter-advertisement saying, are you dying for menthol? Facts about, that African Americans die, and how cool is that? So a very effective counter-advertising strategy. This is another example from the Truth Campaign. Again, kind of calling out the tobacco industry for profiling vulnerable populations, including LGBT, people with mental illness, and also low-income neighborhoods, racial and ethnic minority groups. I think that these ads have been very effective. Oh, too bad they're not going to show. We'll figure out a way that we can share those with you at another time because they're not playing today, unfortunately, in the presentation. Okay. These are just other examples of counter-advertising that you may or may not have seen before. This says secondhand smoke kills, kind of a play on the Marlboro Man. This one kind of speaks for itself. Joe Chemo. Up until now, there really haven't been ads, counter-advertisements specifically targeting behavioral health populations. There haven't been a lot of messages specifically to reach our populations. This was a friend of mine, a nurse from Montana, Claire Lemke. She was really the first one to kind of create an ad like this that was used in Montana. Now lots of other groups have adopted similar messages to say, I didn't survive depression and suicide to die from cancer or smoking, or I had to stop smoking. So again, sometimes it is useful to have messages that are appealing to the population that you're working with, that are tailored, and this is an example of one. The CDC has now done a lot of these. Every year they publish quit stories, real people's stories of quitting smoking, and they profile Rebecca on purpose because she's a person with depression, and you may have seen these ads also on TV that talk about Rebecca's story, quitting smoking, and this is called Tips from Former Smokers, and it's on the CDC website. And unfortunately, I can't show you these videos today, but you can find them on YouTube. So in summary today, there's lots of examples of new products. The tobacco industry isn't going out of business despite the Master Settlement Agreement. They're always coming up with new ways to perhaps create new or better products to hook the next generation on tobacco. That means we all need to be vigilant and continue surveillance and other techniques and monitor what's happening in our communities as a way to combat this. And e-cigarettes is really just the most recent example of this. In particular, I hope we can develop more of these tailored messages that really reach our patients, people with behavioral health problems, things that resonate with them, identify the importance. More of these tailored messages are needed. So thank you for your attention, and I believe we have time for questions.
Line unmuted.
Can type it into the chat box.
I've also unmuted the lines, Jill, in case anybody would like to speak up with a question directly.
Thank you.
I have a question. There was some research around advertising near residential programs for people with serious mental illness. Is that kind of true that there is more advertisement of tobacco?
So it's certainly been proven. That's a great question, Rusty. It's certainly been well established that there's more ads and more stores in low-income neighborhoods. There's also more liquor stores. So that we know. So to the extent, I guess, that some behavioral health programs are also in those neighborhoods, I don't know that it's been studied directly related to behavioral health facilities, but it certainly is already there in low-income neighborhoods. And I don't know of any other specific studies looking at it for behavioral health.
Thanks.
Anybody on the call struggling with e-cigarettes or other products in your program, and how is that being handled?
I'll throw out a question, Jill, maybe as people are kind of thinking. You mentioned some of the risks of e-cigarettes, but I guess I'm curious if there's ever a situation in which you could see yourself kind of encouraging someone, or at least mentioning that as a suggestion for someone who's trying to wean themselves off of normal cigarettes. In part, I'm thinking about like all the consumers that would stand outside of the PROS program that I worked at and just chain smoke one after another, breathing deeply and just consuming all these carcinogens, et cetera. And the fact that you're not burning the paper, et cetera, when using an e-cigarette, there does seem to be some benefit, although you mentioned a lot of the risks. So I just wonder what you think about that.
Sure, and I think that this is something that's actually rapidly changing. I think, so in other countries, like England, they've really adopted the use of e-cigarettes and encouraged the population to use them as a way to try to quit smoking. This country's been a little slower in that approach. In general, people struggle with kind of harm reduction and the idea that, it's safer than a cigarette, but it's not entirely safe, and so people are reluctant to make that recommendation. But I do think that the FDA and other major health organizations in the United States are currently changing and starting to say things like, if all else fails, you could try this, and it is less risky than cigarette smoking, and it may help some people to quit. So I think that's actually happening right now. We obviously need more studies, but I do think that some of the opinion from the health leaders are going to be more in line with the rest of the world in terms of, if this really helps some people to quit smoking, then we just have to live with that, and it's always best to quit smoking. That concerns me a lot less than the impact on teenagers, which I think is really still a huge problem that we're grappling with and nobody knows what to do about. But sure, if I was seeing a patient for a mental illness or an addiction, and they come in and they tell me, I don't know, doc, it worked for me, I've been using it for 6 months and I haven't smoked at all, then that's a good thing. I can't argue with that. So I don't necessarily encourage people to use them, but I do have 1 or 2 patients that say they really have quit completely by using them, and you can't argue with success. That was a great question, Noah.
Thanks.
Hello?
Hi.
Hello?
You have a question?
Hi, yes. I wanted to piggyback on Noah's question and comment about the e-cigarettes, because I also quit smoking cigarettes through e-cigarettes, but it was that first generation e-cigarettes, which based on the presentation was a very low level of tobacco and a very low level addiction, and it was very low. And I'm just wondering how come that happened. Like, do we know why that is happening, that now the tobacco companies are creating this e-cigarette that is just as strong, if not stronger, than cigarettes? Because that one that I had was mostly water. There was no tobacco liquid. It was mostly water with a tiny bit of nicotine in it. It was very, very low, and I was able to quit smoking.
Well, good for you. I'm really glad that you did, because that's always the most important thing. I mean, I think your question is interesting, and so I guess there's two ways to answer it. If I want to be cynical, I would say, well, the tobacco industry knows exactly what they're doing, and they're just trying to hook people on this forever because they don't want to lose a customer.
That's what it seems like. Yeah, that's what it seems like, because the low levels, it's like I can't even see them anymore. It was great because it satisfied the whole addiction that I had, which was the packing of the pack, and it looked like a cigarette, and the holding it between my fingers, and that whole, ceremony that went along with the process of smoking a cigarette. And, when I told my girlfriend about it, she stopped coughing after 2 weeks. She stopped coughing, she stopped using cigarettes, and she was only smoking the low-level first generation cigarettes, and she stopped smoking like the regular cigarettes, and she used to wake up every morning coughing. I could hear her from across the hall in my apartment. And she stopped. She was like, oh my gosh, I stopped coughing and everything. It's like they were so much better. I'm not saying they were great, but they were so much better. And to me, I thought they should have been marketed much like the gum and the patch as a smoking cessation device instead of just to smoke. And I think that you're right. I really think that big tobacco to put their foot in the pie and say, wait a minute, we can't allow this, because that's what it seems like. Because now, like you said, I found out that a lot of regular tobacco companies have taken over e-cigarette business.
So, yeah, so I'm really glad it worked for you and your friend. Remember, the tobacco industry was invited by the federal government to characterize their product as a quit smoking aid, and they said no, thank you, because they don't want to be subject to the research and testing and rules that would be that like nicotine gum has to go through. So they don't want that on purpose. So that's why they're not marketed that way. The other reason, though, that the industry might keep making ones with higher nicotine, if you're a little less cynical, another explanation for that is, for a lot of, even though it worked for you, a lot of people would use those first generation ones and they would say, this is lousy. It doesn't give me a hit like a cigarette does. And so it's also a way to make them more satisfying for people. And that's not entirely bad, because, again, if they're satisfying and people are less likely to smoke, then you could argue that will actually help some people. So it's a little complicated. We don't know for sure, but it's probably a little bit of both of that.
Thank you.
Oh, there's one last thing I just want to say about e-cigarettes. I couldn't remember for a second. But, I don't know if you can tell, but I have sort of mixed feelings. I'm a little bit ambivalent about this myself as an addiction provider because, yes, I want people to quit smoking. I want them to live long lives. And I'm not opposed to harm reduction. But in some ways, when you think about if we really come out and we promote e-cigarettes and we say everybody should just switch from cigarettes to e-cigarettes, that feels a little bit of a complicated message for me personally, because we wouldn't walk into like an alcohol treatment center and just say to everybody, we'll give out the fake beer and go home and drink fake beer, the beer that doesn't have any alcohol in it, and that takes the place of treatment. So I think it's good to have a lot of different solutions and choices for people. But we also don't want to use it as a way to sort of opt out from giving people treatment when they may need treatment, because we don't do that in other forms of substance abuse. So I think that's just sort of another way to think about this. It's a little complicated.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it should be like that. But it's the same thing with going in therapy. You have to still go to program even though you're getting methadone. You still have to go to program. You still get treatment. You still go to groups, and you still get, a counselor. And I agree. And I think that, like what you said before, I think it should be like a last resort. I think it should be a last resort. Because I know I tried the patch, I tried the gum, I tried smoking cessation group, and nothing worked. I was just lucky that the e-cigarettes worked for me because I almost died. So and that was the only thing that worked. And because nothing gave me that satisfaction to the addiction, so I could sit still and learn and accept the treatment and learn about the treatment and do the decisional balance sheet and change the habit, because you could replace a habit with another one, and change the habit. So that was something that's important. But I agree with you. I don't think that it should be done that way. It shouldn't be done that way, because just like I said, with methadone, it's done along with regular treatment. And I think it should have been treated the same way. But I think you're absolutely right. I think you're spot on when you say that Big Tobacco didn't want certain things to happen, and they didn't want to, when they were offered the opportunity, which I didn't know. Thank you for educating me on that. That tells me, that says a lot.
Well, I appreciate you sharing your story, and I'm really glad that things have worked out well for you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you for the information. Thank you for the time.
I see we're at 4 o'clock exactly, so Jill, I don't know if you have any final comments that you want to make.
I'm good, thank you.
Okay. Thank you for, as usual, a very exciting and